The weekly list came in at 0300, the way it always did, and Commander Yale Davon read every name before she let herself have coffee. It was a ritual she'd started 3 months ago, after the Kethvara broke the Callisto perimeter. Before that, the lists had been short enough to scan in a glance. A dozen names, sometimes fewer, the kind of losses that hurt but didn't hollow you. Now they came in at 80-90 names a week, formatted in columns because single file had become too unwieldy. The system had optimized for scale. That detail bothered her more than she could articulate. She read everyone: rank, name, posting, confirmed method. A lieutenant from the Ganymede garrison who died holding a bulkhead door shut from the outside while his squad evacuated. A civilian analyst, no military training whatsoever, who'd apparently picked up a pulse cutter during the Meridian Station breach and managed to buy 11 minutes before the Kethvara overran the position. 11 minutes. Yale sat with that for a long moment, 'cause 11 minutes had meant a full evacuation shuttle made it out. And she was not going to let the arithmetic of that pass unacknowledged. 79 other names. She read them all. Then she made her coffee. The war had been going badly for 8 months. That was the official version, badly. The operational briefings used words like asymmetric pressure and strategic repositioning were the kinds of phrases that got invented when the honest words were too ugly for command channels. What the phrases meant, stripped of their professional upholstery, was that humanity was losing. Not catastrophically, not in the kind of sudden collapse that looked like a tide going out. More like erosion. Station by station, perimeter by perimeter, the Kethvara were pressing, and the lines were giving. The Kethvara were not, by any reasonable measure, beatable in a straight fight. That was the part the briefings didn't say out loud, but every officer above the rank of lieutenant who'd looked at the projections could see it. The Kethvara were older. Older by a margin that made human civilization look like a recent hobby. Their vessels were not ships in any engineering sense humans would recognize. They were grown, or extruded, perhaps simply willed into being by a biology so removed from carbon-baseline life that xenobiologists had largely given up trying to categorize it. Their weapons didn't fire, they resonated. The Kethvara didn't conduct war, they adjusted pressure until things broke. Humanity had going for it, as far as the projections could quantify, was duration. Not strength, not superior technology. Just the fact that humans were very, very difficult to finish. They retreated in good order. They improvised. They survived things they statistically shouldn't have survived. And then they built defenses out of the debris of what had been destroyed, and they held those too. It wasn't enough. The projection said so with quiet, relentless clarity. Holding was not winning. Duration was not victory. The Kethvara could wait. Humanity, with its logistics chains, and its resource limitations, and its 7 billion mouths on Earth alone that needed feeding regardless of whether there was a war on, could not. The only thing that could change the calculation was the Vorath Compact. Yale poured her coffee, stood at the narrow viewport of her office, aboard way station Deimos, and thought about the Vorath. The compact occupied a cluster of 17 systems along what humans had taken to calling the inner shore. Old territory, densely settled, wealthy by any measure she could apply. They were, by temperament and by constitution, neutral. They had been neutral through 3 prior interstellar conflicts, which was a remarkable achievement, and spoke to a certain sophisticated self-interest. The compact positioned itself as something essential, a trade hub, a communication relay, a diplomatic venue that no combatant power could afford to threaten. They were useful in the way that a well-lit road is useful. Nobody burned the road. The Kethvara had never threatened the Vorath. The Vorath had never opposed the Kethvara. The compact's neutrality, in this context, functioned less like principled pacifism and more like a calculated bet. The Kethvara would win, eventually, and it was better to be neutral when that happened than to be among the defeated. Yale understood the logic. She found it nauseating. She understood it. If the Vorath entered the war, if their 1,200 warships and their formidable industrial base and their network of inner-shore relay stations came in on the human side, the projections shifted. Not dramatically, not into certainty, but enough. Enough to change the word losing into something that had room in it for alternatives. She set down her coffee cup and opened a channel to the one person aboard Deimos she genuinely did not want to talk to. His name was Soran, and he was not technically military. His rank was listed as liaison consultant, was a designation that gave him officers' quarters and officers' mess access, and a security clearance that Yale had, 3 separate occasions, found irritating. He worked for an agency that didn't have a public name. He was, in the shorthand of every intelligence and diplomatic community that dealt with him, simply a fixer. He was also the only person she knew who'd ever successfully run an operation inside a Vorath compact security perimeter and gotten out clean. He arrived at her office 11 minutes after she pinged him, which suggested he'd been awake. He probably slept 4 hours a night, if that. He was a compact man, mid-50s, with the kind of face that looked like it'd been designed to be forgettable and had overcorrected into memorable, sheer force of weathering. He wore plain clothes. He always wore plain clothes. "Commander," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk without being invited. "We need to talk about the Vorath," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, very precisely, he said, "No, hear me out. I've heard this argument from 4 different people in the past 6 weeks, Commander. The logic is identical every time. The compact has the ships, they have the industry, they have the strategic position. Go. If we can get them in the war, the math changes. All 4 people who made that argument to me were right. The Vorath are still neutral. And for that. Their intelligence service has documented proof that the Kethvara are planning to absorb the inner shore the moment the human conflict concludes, Yale said. I've read the assessments. They know they're not buying neutrality forever. They're buying time, which is a rational thing to buy. Soren picked a small piece of lint off his sleeve and examined it with the same attention he might have given a technical document. The Vorath have been watching us lose for 8 months. Why would they join a losing side? Because we can give them evidence that tips the calculation. Soran put the lint down. He looked at her with an attention that felt slightly different from ordinary attention, more like being measured than being listened to. Kind of evidence. Yal had prepared for this. She slid a data chip across the desk. Intercepted Kethvara communication logs from the Palladian relay. They're partial, they're fragmented, and our cryptographers believe they're authentic. They suggest the Kethvara are significantly further along in their inner shore contingency planning than the Vorath believe. Sor picked up the chip, turned it once in his fingers without looking at it, set it down. Partial and fragmented. Yes, partial and fragmented means deniable. Partial and fragmented means that when a Vorath intelligence analyst runs it through their verification system, it might pass and it might not. He leaned back. The Vorath High Arbiter is a man named Counselor Drivus. I have met Drivus. He is not a fool. He has seen fabricated evidence before. He will subject anything we present to extraordinary scrutiny. Which is why it needs to be more than what I have, Yale said. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Yale had been in enough difficult conversations to recognize ones when someone was deciding whether to be honest about what they were thinking or whether to let the conversation die politely. Soren chose honesty. You're asking me to supplement what you have. I'm asking you to help me get the Vorath into this war. Those are not the same request. He stood, walked to the viewport, stood where she'd been standing a half hour earlier. Outside, the distant scatter of Deimos Station's traffic moved in slow arcs. Transports, troll vessels, a medical ship running without running lights, because protocol demanded it near the zone perimeter. If I supplement those intercepts, Commander, if I take your partial, fragmented, potentially authentic signals intelligence and make them into something that will pass a Vorath verification sweep, I am committing several categories of crime. I am also potentially committing an act of war against a neutral power if they discover what was done, and I am handing the Kethvara a propaganda gift they will use for decades if this ever becomes public. I know, Yal said. You know. Yes, he turned from the viewport. The station lights outside were cold and blue. Tell me why I should. She had prepared for this too. Preparation didn't make it easier to say. Because I posted 79 names this morning. Next week, it'll be more. The week after, more. You've seen the projections. I know you have, because you have clearances that shouldn't exist. You know what the trajectory looks like. You know that holding isn't a strategy, it's a slower way of losing. She held his gaze. And I think you know that there are maybe 4 or 5 people alive who could pull this off. You're one of them. Soran was quiet for a long time. Then, I'll need resources I can't officially requisition. I'll find them. I'll need access to a Kethvara communication specialist. There's a linguist at the University of New Brisbane, Dr. Olan Rawaju. She's done more work on Kethvara signal architecture than anyone outside their own species. Done. If this goes wrong, he said, with a precision that made the words feel like surgical instruments, it goes wrong in ways that you cannot insulate yourself from. I am telling you this not to frighten you, but because I want you to understand what agreeing to. I understand. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the lint, except this time what he was measuring was something less easy to quantify. Whatever he found, it seemed to satisfy him, or at least not dissuade him. Right, he said. Then we'd better get started. The first 3 weeks were straightforward, which Yale later recognized as the universe's way of building up credit for what came next. Dr. Olan Rawaju, BC, he insisted, with the warmth of a woman who had spent too many years being referred to only by her title, turned out to be precisely as brilliant as her reputation suggested, and also somewhat alarming in person, in the best possible way. She was in her 60s, large and unhurried, with an academic's absolute disregard for the fact that she was now aboard a military way station, helping to forge alien communications intelligence. She treated it as an interesting problem. She requested a second monitor, a specific brand of tea that required 3 separate supply authorizations, and access to the station's raw signal archive. She got all 3. The challenge, she explained to Yale and Soren, on the second day, the tea steaming beside her keyboard, is that Kethvara signal architecture isn't encrypted in any way we understand encryption. It's layered. Each transmission contains, nested inside its own carrier wave, an authentication pattern that's biologically generated, like a fingerprint, except the fingerprint is also part of the message. You can't separate them. So a forgery would fail authentication, Soran said. Conventional forgery would fail instantly, yes. BC pulled up a visualization on her secondary monitor. Something that looked, to Yael, like a 3-dimensional weather system. But what I've been doing for the past 4 years is studying the degradation patterns. When a Kethvara signal travels over a significant distance, or passes through certain kinds of interference fields, the authentication layer degrades in very specific, predictable ways. The pattern is damaged. Not destroyed, damaged. Damaged enough that a forgery could hide inside the damage, Soren said. BC smiled. You'd make a good linguist. She pulled up a second visualization beside the first. I believe so, yes. If we introduce the right kind of interference signature, consistent with a Palladian relay degradation event, which are well documented, we can present Vorath analysts with a signal where the authentication layer is present but partially unreadable. The parts that are readable will authenticate. The parts that are forged will be attributed to the degradation. And the content, Yale said. Content, BC said, picking up her tea, is your department. It was in fact Saran's department. He worked on it for 11 days, with the door to his quarters locked and a do not disturb flag on his room system that Yale chose to respect. When he emerged, he had lost 4 pounds and gained something around the eyes that she didn't quite have a word for. Not guilt. More like the look of a person who had done something they'd spent a long time deciding was worth doing, found that deciding and doing were 2 very different categories of experience. The signal content was, on its face, exactly what they needed. A high-level planning discussion between Kethvara strategic nodes. The closest human analog would be something between a general staff meeting and a biological nerve cluster, detailing the timeline and methodology for absorbing the inner shore systems following the resolution of the human conflict. It named specific Vorath installations. It discussed, in the cold, pressurized language of Kethvara communication, the particular value of the compact's relay network infrastructure and the most efficient protocols for conversion. It would be, if it worked, the most important document in the war. It's good, BC said, reading through Soran's draft against her own Kethvara reference corpus. The signal architecture is. This is genuinely impressive. Where did you learn to do this? Somewhere it would have been better not to have learned, Soren said. BC looked at him over the rim of her tea. The content is accurate in flavor at least. Planning methodology is consistent with how they actually operate. She paused. You didn't have to make it accurate. You could have invented something more dramatic. Dramatic is harder to believe, Soren said. The most convincing lie is the one that's mostly true. Counselor Drivus arrived at Way Station Deimos 17 days later, in a Vorath diplomatic vessel that docked quietly, without ceremony, in a sealed bay that Yale had cleared of all personnel for the duration. The Vorath preferred discretion. Neutrality was a currency they'd spent centuries accumulating, and every visible meeting with a belligerent power was a small deduction from the account. Drivos was tall by human standards, though the Vorath weren't a species designed around height. It was more that they moved in a way that seemed to take up a vertical space. Something in the articulation of their secondary shoulder joints that made them seem poised to unfold into something larger. He had the deep violet eye sheen that distinguished senior Vorath from their younger counterparts. And he looked at Yael with a particular quality of attention that she imagined had been refined across several hundred years of diplomatic meetings. Commander, he said, his standard was perfect. Of course it was. You indicated this meeting was of significant urgency. Thank you for coming. Counselor, I know what it cost you to be here. What it cost me, he said, is a question we will not discuss. What it might cost if I hadn't come is a more interesting subject. You said you had information relevant to compact security. Have intercepted Kethvara strategic communications, Yale said, originating from the Palladian Relay Network. We believe they document Kethvara planning for inner-shore absorption. Following the conclusion of the current conflict, Drivus didn't react visibly. The Vorath were very good at not reacting visibly. You believe. The signals have been partially degraded in transit. They've been authenticated against our Kethvara signal corpus by an expert in the field, confident they're genuine. Confident is a word that tends to expand to fill the space available. He held out his hand for the data chip. She placed it there. He turned it once the way Soren had, except Dravus's version of the gesture felt like a different kind of scrutiny entirely. Older, more patient. I will want my own analysts to review this. Of course, that will take time. I understand. He looked at her. The violet sheen in his eyes caught the station lighting and held it. Commander, I have sat across from a great many people who were trying to influence me. Some of them were very good at it. Some of them were people I admired. A pause, measured as precisely as anything Yale had encountered. What you are doing is not difficult for me to see. The room felt, briefly, as though it had contracted. Counselor, you believe the signals are genuine, he said, and the emphasis he put on believe contained entire diplomatic dictionaries. You may be right. You may be entirely right. The Kethvara are, by the evidence of the past 8 months, a threat we have perhaps underweighted. But I want you to understand something. He set the chip on the table between them, rather than pocketing it. The compact does not make decisions based on a single data point. If what you've brought me is what you say it is, my analysts will find that. If it is something else, something more complicated, my analysts will find that too. The pause again. Is there anything you would like to add before I take this back to my people? The silence that followed was the longest 7 seconds of Yale Davin's career. She thought about 79 names. She thought about an analyst, with no combat training, buying 11 minutes with a pulse cutter. She thought about the projections, their smooth and terrible trajectory. She thought about Soran's 11 days behind a locked door, and BC's careful needle, threaded through degraded signal noise, and the 3 people in a room who knew what they'd done and would carry it in the file of things you cannot say out loud. No, she said, nothing to add. Dravus picked up the chip. He inclined his head, a Vorath gesture that managed to be both respectful and entirely non-committal, and departed the room with the same unhurried velocity with which he'd entered it. The wait lasted 19 days. Yale posted 3 more lists in that time, 211 names. She read everyone. Saran spent 19 days in a state of professional stillness that she recognized, having watched him closely enough now, as a disguised form of sustained anxiety. He ate normally, he attended briefings, he read. Once, at 200, she found him in the observation lounge, standing at a viewport doing nothing at all. Not working, not on his comm, just standing. And she made 2 cups of tea and stood beside him for 40 minutes, without either of them saying anything. It felt like the right thing to do. She didn't examine it further than that. BC, who had been given permission to stay on pending the outcome, spent the time writing a paper on Kethvara signal degradation patterns. She seemed genuinely excited about it. Yael found this, in its own way, the most fortifying thing she encountered during those 19 days. A person who looked at what they'd been pulled into the middle of and extracted something worth knowing. The answer came not in the form she'd expected. There was no diplomatic communique, no official channel response. What happened was that her long-range sensors flagged a massive Varath fleet movement at 0600 on a Thursday morning, 1240, vessels crossing the inner shore boundary into the contested zone. Their identification beacons broadcasting compact allegiance, their weapons powered, and their course set for the Kethvara staging positions along the Palladian meridian. The war changed, in the way that wars sometimes do, not dramatically, not in a single moment of obvious transformation, but in the sudden, massive shift of what was possible. The Kethvara had been applying pressure, steady and relentless, for 8 months. They'd applied it because their intelligence apparatus, which was very good, had told them that pressure would work. The Varath were neutral. Humanity was burning down. There was no reason not to wait. They had not calculated for what they were looking at now. Yael stood in the ops center and watched the tactical display resolve into something she hadn't seen in 8 months, numbers that went in both directions. Forces that added rather than only subtracted. A line that wasn't retreating. The word came from Earth Command at 0900. The Voroth Compact had forcefully declared mutual defense with the United Earth Coalition. The Kethvara had, in response, begun pulling forces back from 3 contested systems. The Palladian perimeter was holding for the first time since the initial assault. She should have felt relief. She did feel relief, the specific, exhausted relief of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and is finally allowed to exhale. But there was something else underneath it. Something that didn't dissolve when the good news arrived, something that had the texture of a splinter. She found Saran in his quarters. He was sitting at his desk, not working. He looked up when she came in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not quite sure what she'd come to say. "It worked," she said. "Yes. Drive us as analysts past the signal." "Yes." He turned his chair slightly to face her directly. The degradation signature held. The authentication fragments authenticated. The content was consistent with what they already suspected, which made it easy to believe. He paused. It was a good forgery. It was. The silence between them had a different quality than the one in the observation lounge. That one had been companionable. This one was more like 2 people standing on opposite banks of something. "I keep thinking about the names," Yael said. "The lists. And I think I know that fewer of them will die now. That's real. That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It isn't nothing. And what we did was, there's a word for it, several words, none of them are clean." "No." She leaned against the doorframe. Outside, Soran's viewport, she could see the edge of the station's docking arm. Cold metal, the blue-black of space beyond it. Distant planet that was just a color smear from here. A burnt orange, like the end of something. "Would you do it again?" He thought about it for a long time. She appreciated that he thought about it. Rather than giving her a quick answer either way. "Yes," he said. "I would do it again. I would not feel good about doing it. I would not expect to feel good about it. But yes." He folded his hands on the desk. "The question that stays with me is whether yes is the answer a good person gives. Maybe both things can be true. Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. He didn't sound dismissive either. He sounded like a person who had decided to carry the weight without pretending it was light. "What will you do with your logs? The records of what we discussed. The requisition trail." Yael had been thinking about this. "I'll delete them." "That's probably wise. It feels like cowardice." "It might be both." He looked at her steadily. "Wisdom and cowardice often look the same from the outside. The difference is what you know when you're alone with it." She pushed off the doorframe. The Vorath are in the war. The lines are holding. We're going to fight our way out of this. She held his gaze. We bought that. At a cost. At a cost, she agreed. She left him sitting at his desk. In the corridor outside, she almost ran into BC, who was carrying 2 cups of tea with the careful focus of a person transporting something important. Commander, BC said, not quite stopping. The news, the compact. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, balancing the tea. Then, I finished paper on the degradation patterns. I'm going to submit it to the Xenolinguistics Journal. She looked at Yael with a kind of tranquil directness. Just the linguistic findings, not the context. That seems right. It's genuinely interesting science. A small pause. That's also not nothing. No, Yael said. It isn't. BC continued down the corridor, navigating her cups of tea around a passing technician with practiced ease. Yael watched her go. Then she turned back toward her office, where the morning's list was waiting. 53 names today. Still too many. Still a weight she had no right to put down. But fewer than last week. Fewer than the week before. She walked back down the corridor, turned into her office, sat at her desk and began to read. It was 6 weeks later, when the Palladian line had not only held but advanced. 2 Kethvara staging systems had been recaptured. And the word winning had crept into operational briefings for the first time in a year, that the message arrived. It came from the Vorath Compact's internal diplomatic channel, a secure frequency that Demos Station had access to only because the Compact had provisionally opened it after the Alliance Declaration. The message was addressed to Commander Yael Davan, personal, and it was from Counselor Drivus. It said, I know, 3 words, no elaboration, no accusation, no threat, no demand, just I know. Yael sat with the message for a long time. She didn't forward it to Saran, though she thought about it. She didn't add it to any record. She looked at it on her screen until it became just shapes, the way any word does if you look at it long enough. Just marks that meant something, because people had agreed they did. Then she thought about what Drivas had also done. He had taken the chip. He had given it to his analysts. He had waited for their report. He had presumably received a report that contained some gradation of doubt, enough to see, or enough to suspect, or enough to know. And then he had moved 1,240 ships, a man who could see the shape of a manipulation and choose to act on it anyway, because the manipulation happened to be pointing at a true thing, because the Kethvara were in fact planning the inner shore, because the forgery, built on real foundations by people who understood what was at stake, was guilty of exaggeration, but not of pure invention. Drivas had danced with the same devil from his side of the floor. She typed back a reply. It took her 4 attempts to find the right words, and when she found them, she wasn't sure they were right, only that they were honest. She wrote, I know that you know, and I believe we were both right. She sent it. She didn't know if he would respond. He didn't, as it turned out. But 2 days later, the Compact's diplomatic liaison to Earth Command sent through a formal request for expanded intelligence sharing protocols, which was, as diplomatic gestures went, as clear a response as she could have hoped for. The war turned. Not cleanly, not quickly. Wars don't end the way they begin, with a clear moment you can point to. The Kethvara pressed and were pressed back. They lost 2 more staging systems by the end of the year. They began for the first time showing behaviors that Yale's analysts categorized as contingency adjustment, the alien analog of rethinking the plan. The lists got shorter. 30 names 1 week, 22 the next. A week, impossibly, of 9. She read everyone. She kept reading them all, because that was the minimum. The least she could do for the people who died, while she was in a room deciding what she was willing to do. The names were not abstract. They were not numbers. They were the weight that kept the arithmetic honest. She didn't see Soran again for 3 months. He was, by his nature, a person who appeared when there was work to do and disappeared when it was done. He sent her a single message when the Kethvara withdrew from the Palladian Meridian entirely, which was widely considered to be the turning point of the war. The message said, the souffle rose. She had no idea what that meant. She suspected it was a reference to something that she'd need more context for. She replied, it did. Then she went and posted the week's list. 11 names. She read them all. It was the only thing she could do that felt proportionate to what they were. It was not proportionate. Nothing was. But she did it anyway. Because the alternative, The adding up without the reading, the statistics without the names, was the first step toward the kind of thinking that had made some of the worst things in human history seem efficient and defensible in the moment, and catastrophic in retrospect. The names were a kind of discipline. They kept her honest in the way that the splinter under the skin keeps you from forgetting the thing that put it there. Commander Yael Devon kept her logs. She didn't delete them in the end, despite what she'd told Sauron she would do. They sat in an encrypted archive on a server that only she had access to, and she was aware, with a clarity that she hadn't been able to shake since the night she'd called Sauron into her office, she might be keeping them because they were a record, or she might be keeping them because she needed to be the kind of person who could face the record, and she wasn't always sure there was a difference. She was prepared to live with that uncertainty. That was, maybe, the most human thing about all of it. Not the ingenuity, not the stubbornness, not the willingness to bend rules in the service of survival. Those were all real. But the most human thing was the capacity to act in the space where right and wrong were not clearly marked, to do it, with eyes open and full knowledge of the cost. And then to keep standing there afterward, without the comfort of certainty, carrying the weight of what you'd done into whatever came next. The Kethvara had never modeled for that. It was outside their frame. Maybe it should have stayed outside humanity's too. That was a fair argument, and Yael could make it. And some mornings when the lists came in she believed it. But the lists were getting shorter. The lines were holding. The war was turning, name by name, week by week, in the direction of something that looked, from where she stood, like a future. She would take that. She would take it and carry it, and not look away from what it cost. At 0300 on a Thursday morning, the list came in at 6 names. She made her coffee first. For the first time in 4 months. Then she read them all.